For all my people on YouTube, just one more reminder, I'm not a doctor. I've now had 2 videos removed from YouTube, both speaking about COVID-19 and the overall pandemic response, and also vaccines, and some verifiable, absolutely true data that suggests a possible connection, possible being the operative word here, between some negative side effects and vaccines. So, I'm talking specifically about the mRNA vaccines. So those videos were both removed from YouTube. My best guess after the more recent one got taken down first, and couldn't get any answers from YouTube on which part of my video, what exactly about it violated the medical misinformation policy that YouTube has on their platform. Then subsequently, about a week later, an earlier video that I had recorded also got taken down. So, and again, I have not gotten any specific answer. So YouTube, it's really hard to know what I need to adjust or not say if you won't tell me. But here we go, talking about COVID-19 and vaccines again. So this time, if I get a video taken down, I will be one more strike away from being permanently banned from YouTube. So if I get one more strike, I will have a suspension. After this latest strike, I wasn't able to post anything on YouTube for a week. This one will be a longer suspension if I get another one removed. And then if I get a 4th video removed, it will be a permanent ban from YouTube. So, playing with fire here, but I'm not going to stop talking about real stuff that impacts other ordinary people like me, who is, despite the vibes I have going on here, not a medical professional or pretending to be a doctor or any sort of expert, actually. I'm proud to not be in the realm of experts these days. I'm a stay-at-home mom. I'm an ordinary person. I see information from people who are telling the truth, and I regurgitate it here on this platform. So I'm going to cite every source that I talk through today. And I'm also going to read this fun medical note, because the only difference I could find, since YouTube wouldn't tell me why I'm getting censored, the one difference I could find is that the sources from which I pull from on YouTube specifically include a medical note and a disclaimer. So the CDC states that COVID-19 vaccines are safe, effective, and reduce your risk of severe illness. Hundreds of millions of people have received a COVID-19 vaccine, and serious adverse events are uncommon. Okay, so nothing in here is medical advice. Quite the contrary. If nothing else, this is just an encouragement to go look at the sources I'm listing and come to your own conclusions. It's a powerful thing. Okay, so I'm going to start with a video from Dr. John Campbell. He's somebody that I follow. He's wonderful. He's out of the UK. A great doctor. He's talking a lot about a lot of this stuff. So he posted a video a few weeks ago that I thought was really great. It's getting to the infection fatality rate. So I'm going to tell you first just an anecdote from a couple of days ago. I was at the gym, and if people are going to talk loudly enough in public for me to hear, like, I'm going to eavesdrop shamelessly. So I'm just sitting there in the lobby, and 2 women at the front desk were talking, and one of them was talking about how her and her spouse have gotten COVID twice. They said more recently. And then she was talking, kind of sort of joking, but I could tell, like, you could tell she was really serious and just kind of poking fun at, like, oh, back in the day when we thought we were going to die from COVID. And she was talking, this is somebody I'd estimate in her 30s, maybe early 30s, maybe late 20s, who knows. But she and her spouse got COVID, and she was describing, the earlier strain. And she was like, yeah, and then we were hearing everywhere, the 5th day is the day that you die and everything. So she was like, we were texting our friends. And they were like, how are you? And we're like, stay fine, I'm dying. And she was like, we were really scared. Like, we were actually really scared that we were going to die. And she was like, looking back, it's so funny because I've had other viruses and colds that were so much worse. I had really like the same symptoms of this strain. I don't know why I was so scared, but we were like, like writing our will while we had COVID. So, and I thought that story, it seemed powerful to me because we're in a state of amnesia in this country, which, the Atlantic would have you call amnesty. And I'm all about forgiveness. I'm all about assuming the best in people and the best of intentions. I'm also about accountability, because the way to change future responses and make them better and not so detrimental to society is to learn from the past. And in order to learn from the past, wouldn't you like to see a world where these academic and scientific and medical experts and these politicians actually take accountability and say, hey, we were wrong, let's course correct in the future? Rather than this day of like the news cycle changes so rapidly that we forget the fact that we all thought we were going to die early on in this pandemic as young, healthy people thought we were going to die. So Dr. John Campbell in this video talks about the modeling that was used to estimate infection fatality rate. So that's IFR is the acronym. It is different than case fatality rate. So case fatality rate is confirmed cases. For example, I'm almost positive had COVID, maybe even more than once. I have never gone and tested positive. A lot of people are in that boat. If your symptoms are more mild, it just stands to reason you're less likely than somebody who is severely ill, going to the hospital, going to an urgent care facility even, and getting tested. So case fatality rate is different. Those fatality rates are going to be much higher than infection fatality rates, because infections includes the whole group of people who weren't tested but also had COVID. And there have been studies now, this one I'm going to talk about is out of Stanford University in the US. They analyzed data specifically in the US of people with antibodies. So, but Dr. John Campbell talks about the model, the paper that was the most widely respected paper that a lot of governments base their COVID response on. And he estimated, this paper estimated infection fatality rate of 0.9%. And they also estimated in that paper that about 4.4% of people infected would be hospitalized. So that was their estimated infection fatality rate. Now, Dr. John Campbell's opinion, he thinks that, they were looking more, they modeled their estimates more on case fatality rate, and they kind of maybe got those two things confused, and that's why their estimate was so pessimistic. One could also argue, if you're just a non-biased person looking from the outside, that you would want to err on the side of estimating more pessimistically. So I'll give them that even. I'm going to even give them that. But 0.9% overall infection fatality rate for COVID-19. This is the original Wuhan strain. This is before any vaccination programs or countermeasures were put in place. That was the estimate that most governments were, certainly the government in the UK was basing their COVID response on. So this more recent Stanford University, it's interesting because it's age stratified. And you can go, I'm going to cite this, you can go and look at the study. You can read more into the terminology. You can read more into how the study was set up. It's a really impressive one. But here's what they found. So what was actual pre-vaccine? So again, before any mitigation measures were put in place, before the vaccination program, what was the actual infection fatality rate for these different age groups? So for people age 0 to 59, the median infection fatality rate was 0.035%. That's also, they note, their most pessimistic view because they can't account for seroreversion. I'm going to let you go back and look at the study and see what seroreversion means, but this was to the best of their ability, people who still had antibodies, and they weren't accounting for seroreversion. So in essence, the median 0.035% infection fatality rate was their best estimate, and their most pessimistic one as well. So it could have, they said, and they'll get later, I'll tell you what it could have been as low as. So we're still talking about in the US specifically, and remember that in the US, we're not super healthy. So our numbers are worse than when you take the aggregate global numbers, because people in the US are more obese. We're an aging population, relatively speaking, to some countries. We have a lot more people with comorbidities than other countries. So infection fatality rate for people ages 0 to 69, so the widest group of people that were tested, and they'll go back and tell you why they weren't able in this study to take into account older people, which we know and can safely assume will be higher than these numbers that we're talking about now. So actual pre-vaccine infection fatality rate for people ages 0 to 69 was 0.095%, so 10 times lower than the rate that the modelers originally assumed of 0.9. Infection fatality rate for people 0 to 19, So our kiddos, 0 point, let's see if I can remember all these zeros, 0.0003%. Oh, after all those zeros, we finally got like a positive number. Okay, IFR, so infection fatality rate for age range 20 to 29 years old, 0.003%. Infection fatality rate for people ages 30 to 39, 0.011%. An actual pre-vaccine infection fatality rate for people ages 40 to 49, 0.035%, according to the study. An infection fatality rate for 50 to 59, 0.129%, so still lower than the overall global estimate on which many pandemic responses were based. Ages 60 to 69, so the highest age range in this study, 0.501%. So if you take the aggregate of all of that, so not accounting for age stratified data, and the nuances of, say, a 5-year-old versus a 65-year-old, in the US, 0.501%. And of course, so 0.5%, and of those people, most of them were older and had an average of 4 comorbidities. So they're estimated at a global level. This study says that infection fatality rate globally may have been as low as for people 0 to 59 years old, 0.03%, and for ages 0 to 69 years old, 0.07%. So further data is needed to look at the above 69 years old population, but this is making a pretty strong case. If we had seen these numbers before, if the original modeling had been closer to these numbers, who would have been scared of dying from COVID if they were in their 20s? Not many people. It's such a fraction of a percentage point that I think that this is my opinion here, not as a medical professional or as an expert of any source, but my opinion is this was overblown, is the gist of this that I'm taking away from this. So why is that important? I'm going to jump to another report that I'm going to also link. And like, look at us. We've gone all in on this vaccine program. We're still on the train of boosters. And I would just argue that it's easier to stop a train before it even starts. I think this is why it was important and why so many people in our country especially were screaming like, we need the data first. Because look at us, now that we're getting the data retroactively, the train's already moving. The train's already full steam ahead down the tracks, doing damage to a lot of people. So this is from Alex Berenson Substack, and it's about a medical examiner in Milwaukee County. His name is Dr. Brian L. Peterson. I'm going to link to this story because if you, like me, do an internet search for Brian L. Peterson, you're going to hear a lot about, like, where did he go? These judges are looking for him. Did he retire? Was he fired? We don't know. So he was asked for his resignation. And this story gives you a little bit more context as to why. So it so happens that after 11,500 autopsies for over 4 decades, this doctor was used to high-profile forensic work. So he did a lot of murder cases. He's a medical examiner. He worked on the big 2004 trial of Scott Peterson. So up until recently, he served as chief medical examiner for Milwaukee County. With about 1 million people, that county alone has roughly 10,000 deaths a year, and its pathologists conduct about 1,500 autopsies annually. So when the coronavirus epidemic began, Dr. Peterson decided he was going to review every single COVID-related death in the county to see for himself who was dying and how. So of these deaths ruled as COVID deaths, which of them were actually dying as a primary cause of COVID, which of them had comorbidities, which of them had another death as a primary cause potentially, and happened to test positive for COVID. So something a lot of people have been sounding the alarm on, but just kind of dismissed into the category of conspirators. So this is an actual medical examiner. And so here's what he found. So roughly 20% of those deaths that physicians certified as COVID related were not. And they would be the ones that an average person would look at and go, oh, like an example would be a homicide victim who also had COVID. That accounted for about 20%, which is a pretty good chunk of deaths ruled as COVID. I'm going to talk about some potential explanation for why they were ruled as COVID, other than what's the obvious that's going through a lot of more conspiratorial heads watching this. But another example, like I'm looking at a report right now, he did of a 92-year-old female who died of complications of Alzheimer dementia. And she also tested positive for coronavirus. And she also had hypertension. So those were listed under the category of other, like she just happened to have these things, but she died of complications of Alzheimer's. So those are the types of examples included in this 20% of reported as COVID. Guess what? They didn't die from COVID, you guys. Another 20% of deaths came in people with very late stage cancer or other terminal conditions who did have COVID and symptoms specific to COVID when they died. So those people, this medical examiner says, would likely have died in days or weeks, even if they had not been infected. Still, he added COVID to their death certificates as a secondary cause since the virus had hastened their death, in his opinion. In other words, about 40% of all of the deaths attributed to COVID in Milwaukee County, analyzed by this medical examiner, he concluded, had either a very marginal link to COVID or none at all as a cause of death. The remaining 60% came in people who had positive coronavirus tests, had COVID symptoms, and they received COVID-specific treatments, and they were not otherwise at imminent risk of death when they contracted COVID and died. So in those cases, in those 60%, Peterson agreed that COVID was the primary cause of death, and he reported it that way on their death certificates. And still, he says the people who died of COVID in that 60% were almost always extremely unhealthy. That's what this medical examiner said. Even those folks had comorbidities that were substantial. And Alex Berenson interviewed him. He asked him, he said directly, just straight up, of those 4,000 COVID deaths, how many people would you classify as healthy before they contracted COVID? So in that 60%, though, actually were COVID deaths in your medical examiner report, how many would you classify as healthy? He said fewer than 100. He said, can you be more specific? He said dozens. In other words, fewer than 1% of all the COVID deaths that he reviewed had occurred in people who were not already very unwell. He goes on to ask him if there were any examples in younger people. Anyway, so Dr. Peterson, his unwillingness to kind of rubber stamp COVID deaths became more and more controversial over time. So as part of, fun fact, Biden's administration's American Rescue Plan, quote unquote, it included government reimbursements of up to $9,000 for funeral expenses for COVID deaths. So run through the Federal Emergency Management Agency, this funeral program was retroactive to January 2020. In other words, if you had COVID listed as the primary cause of death on your death certificate, your loved one's death certificate, you get reimbursed up to $9,000 for funeral expenses. So nonetheless, the government, this program has paid out more than $2.6 billion to more than 400,000 families, and it's still continuing. And this medical examiner called it the COVID bounty. He said it became an issue. A lot of families were angry when I wouldn't put COVID on the death certificate. So understandably, families are looking at this going, but my loved one had COVID. I could get up to $9,000 from the government for funeral services. Please just put COVID on the death certificate. Anyway, still, he kept filling them out as he saw fit as a medical examiner. He also posted anonymized COVID death certificates along with other death certificates on the Milwaukee County Medical Examiner's website. So an invaluable resource if you want to know the truth, not a convenient resource for him to be loud and proud about if you don't. So anyways, he was called into an emergency meeting with Milwaukee County's head of human resources. This is according to Dr. Peterson. And he didn't know it was coming, though, in retrospect, he says they had already turned off his email forwarding over the weekend. But in a 4-minute meeting, he was told he had two choices, resign or retire. He could resign, and he chose to resign. He was escorted back to the medical examiner's building by 3 sheriff's deputies. He waited for his personal effects, and he was never allowed inside again. So a lot of people, like judges in these ongoing cases he was supposed to testify in, were like, where did homeboy go? Did he just disappear on us? So that's what's happened there. And I also just want to jump lastly to just a third quick snippet. This is also in a video. I'm just going to post the video. It's a member of parliament in the UK, Sir Christopher Chope. So he describes in this video that I'm going to link to how he has personally reviewed coroner's reports all across UK listing the mRNA vaccine as the primary cause of death. And then he begins to cite this data coming out of Germany's Paul Ehrlich, I think is how you pronounce it, Institute. So they're responsible for vaccine safety in Germany. Mind you, Germany is a very well-respected country in the medical community because of their healthcare program and their relatively good healthcare numbers. So in July 20th of this year, this institute estimated, they put out a report that said 1 in 5,000 people who received COVID mRNA vaccines will have a serious effect following vaccination, and that statistically every 10th person should expect an adverse event. So this guy's just advocating for, basically what I'm getting at with these three examples is risk-benefit ratio. We're seeing that the risk, do people die from COVID? Absolutely. Should we be concerned about that? Absolutely. Should we be mindful of the people at risk in our population and how to protect them? Absolutely. But we're increasingly seeing a case that risk is much lower than it's ever been shoved down our throats. As, flashback to the anecdote I just gave you of my friend at the gym talking to her friend about how she and her spouse thought that they were going to die as young, healthy people. So we have this overblown risk combined with a vaccine program that we're in the world of getting boosted, and this is just fact. This booster did not require new human trials. It's been tested on it was approved based on a study and a handful of mice. And that's what we're going off of. And it was approved on the day, by the way, that this study was concluding. So without even longer term data on said mice. But we're in this kind of all in, full steam ahead. The trains are rolling. We're all supposed to get vaccinated because we have amnesia. And I don't know why we lack the ability to course correct and go, wait, can we just pause all of this and reanalyze the true risk and the true benefit? And can we get a new analysis here? Because in my mind, as a stay-at-home mom, as a lay person, in my mind, our understanding of the risks of COVID infection is honing in on a very different story than the one originally painted. And simultaneously, the risks of mRNA vaccinations are looking stronger and stronger and stronger. This Sir Christopher whatever, in this video I'm going to link to, he goes on to talk about how the UK government is funding all of these long COVID clinics, but they're not doing anything for all of these vaccine injuries, which are becoming more and more significant and more broadly understood. And he likens that, I've mentioned this before on this podcast to, hey, remember back in 1976 when the swine flu vaccine was pulled because of way fewer adverse events than we've seen from the COVID-19 vaccines. Now, I would sit back as, again, a lay person and observe and just notice that since 1976, a lot has changed in terms of our attitudes towards vaccinations in general and our vaccination program. I was born in 1986. I think I had I had less than 10 total vaccines as a child. Now, if you look at the childhood vaccination program, we're vaccinating children with this is according to the CDC's website, with about 70 total vaccines. Children are getting, what is that? I'm not a mathematician or anything, but 7 times more about vaccines than I got as a child born in the 80s. So they've just become so ubiquitous. And so when we attach the word vaccine to a medical intervention like mRNA, brand new mRNA vaccine technology, it has become so widely adopted and so ubiquitous that we seem to lack the ability to understand as a society that the analysis, as we get new information, this risk-benefit profile has changed. It's changed in my mind. It's changed in a lot of doctors' minds who are looking at this. It's changed in a lot of other ordinary people's minds. And we're going, wait. Okay, I know that a lot of people were screaming early on, firing warning shots about this. And they were just shuffled over here into the category of conspiracy theorists and anti-vaxxer. And now what those people have been shouting all along is becoming increasingly closer to the truth. Widely accepted, well-known, uncensored truth. And yet our attitudes towards our response and the vaccine program isn't changing along with that. Whew, that's about all I have energy for. And I think I talked a lot longer than I anticipated. Thanks for joining me today. And we'll see if this one stays up on YouTube or not with all the disclaimers.